supposed to memorize all the Old Testament. I'm giving you about 4 weeks to do that, so hopefully you did that. And y'all pray for my throats. Seems like it's not really doing a whole lot better than it was Wednesday night, but I've been sick, isn't it? There's nothing like being off work and being sick, isn't that? Just, that's the way it goes. You get a holiday off work and you're sick, but, I guess that's, at least I'm still getting paid, so that's a blessing. Anyway, so let's do the Old Testament books of the Bible, Genesis all the way to Malachi. We'll just run through them one time, and if you don't get them, don't feel too bad, but at the same time, you ought to feel like a mangy dog, I guess. You ought to really try to get these. It really help you. So I may mess up toward, Micah and Nahum, somewhere right in there, but I'll try to get it all the way through there. So let's start Genesis, run all the way through, and then we'll get into 1 Timothy, okay? Starting with Genesis. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalm, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, that's not right, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Told you I'd probably mess up right in there, but I got it pretty good. So some of y'all didn't even try. Some of you's looking down at your Bible. And so, won't call any names out. Yeah, you was reading them. At least you didn't lie, so that's a good thing. All right, 1 Timothy chapter 3. I got a lot to talk about. I'm going to try my best to get through the rest of these qualifications of a bishop, which really it continues on into a deacon, and all that kind of stuff too. So I want to try to get through all these as best I can. We've been through these, I know teaching Sunday school a couple times a month, you kind of just only get through so much, but there's just sometimes you just kind of get bogged down on a verse or whatever. So I'll try my best to get through them. If I don't, I apologize, but I don't really apologize. It just is what it is. There'd always be next time unless the Lord comes back, and then, at that point it won't matter. So anyway, 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 3 is where we left off. We kind of stopped right here in the middle. So that 1 Timothy 3 and 3, not given to wine, we talked about that, no striker, and this is where we'll pick up today. Not greedy of filthy lucre, but patient, not a brawler, not covetous. So I want to talk about that, not greedy of filthy lucre. These are qualifications of a bishop, of a pastor, and there's been a lot of them that have really given a black eye to the cause of Christ because of this selfish desire of greedy, filthy lucre. And that's just, getting, people say whatever they want to. You can get rich off religion. I mean, you can really make a lot of money if you really know how to sweet talk people and pull at their heartstrings. Notice what I said, religion. I didn't say relationship with Christ. But there's a lot of people, that flowing oil Bible that was over in Dalton for a while that came out, they was buying mineral oil from Tractor Supply or whatever. There's no telling how much money they made off that. And they claimed that, we don't charge anything. I'm sure they didn't charge nothing because they didn't have to. People was probably just throwing money at them left and right. And it came out they was doing all that. So, stuff like that's just greedy of filthy lucre. Of course, greedy means selfish desire. Filthy means dirty. Lucre means money. So a man shouldn't be in it for the money for himself. Now, when a man preaches on giving and tithing and missions giving, whatever, there'll be some that'll walk away from that and they'll say, well, he just wants our money. But just because the preacher preaches about giving or tithing, if it's biblical, there's nothing wrong with that. But people that are tightwads are the only ones that have a problem with that. Isn't that right? There's some of them that squeeze the dollar bill so much. I mean, they just crumple it up in their hand. They don't want to get rid of it. And people are just a bunch of tightwads when it comes to things of God, but they'll spend money on Amazon and eBay and Sheen and whatever else is out there nowadays. I like to hit all that stuff. But anyway, I got my own stuff I spend my money on, okay? I've been spending money on vehicles lately and trying to keep them up, so that's just the way it goes, I guess. But just because a man preaches on giving don't mean it's wrong. But giving to the work of God is biblical. But if a man preaches in a manner that would pat his own pockets, that's when it becomes a problem. 1 Peter chapter 5, let's go there. I got a lot of ground to cover. I'm going to get you to turn a few places here and there, but I'm going to try to get through these quick as possible if I can. But at the same time, if They'll always be next time if I don't. First Peter chapter 5, verse number 1. Leave your finger or whatever over there in First Timothy 3 if you hadn't already slipped it out. What? See, you'll be back there in a minute. First Peter. I'm sorry. First Peter chapter 5, verse 1. The elders which are among you I exhort, who am also an elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed. Here's the responsibility of an elder. Elder and bishop are kind of used in synonymous terms in a lot of ways, and I think this is talking about the under shepherd, because later on it talks about the chief shepherd. But anyway, so verse 2, feed the flock of God which is among you. That's the first responsibility of an under shepherd, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre, but of a ready mind. So if a man's trying to pat his own pockets, if he's doing anything to get more money, and the number one way that happens is this: they water down a message to get more people. That's wrong completely. Our responsibility as a God-called man of God, you got to be called by God first, but it's to preach the whole counsel of God. Don't drive the people. It's been said, and it's true, sheep are not, they won't be driven. They don't do well when you try to drive them. They do well when you lead them, and you do that, by example. So you ought to be an example for the believers and not do it for money. I really think a lot of the Apostle Paul, and I'm not saying God can't, call a man into full-time ministry in terms of the pastorate or evangelist or missionary, and I'm not saying that, so don't, split hairs with me about that. But I've always looked at Paul. He could have commanded those churches, y'all pay me a salary, but he didn't do it. Instead, he went to work being a tent maker, and he abode with Aquila and Priscilla, and he went and worked with his hands so he wouldn't be chargeable to any of the people of God, that he was in it for the money only. So I don't think it's wrong for a man to be bivocational or trivocational or quadruple vocational or whatever you got to do, make some money or whatever. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Now, God can call a man to a full-time ministry. Church can do that and support that. That's good. But you got to be careful about that stuff, though. I think a job keeps a man grounded, just preaching the whole counsel of God, and so I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So I told y'all, and I'm honest about this, I'd pastor this church for free. I don't think that, now on the flip side, I think a church ought to take care of the man of God, but I even offered to take a pay cut, just a little while ago. But here's the thing. I believe it's God's will for me to pastor this church, and as long as I'm in the will of God, I believe the Lord will take care of me at the end of the day. But here, look, God's not going to take care of me. It's been said, don't pray for a hole while you're leaning on a shovel. Get shovel and go to work. You know what I'm saying? God's given me, a mind, body. I may have to work a job I hate, but, there'll be something out there I could do. I could go back to Bojangles. I'd hate to do that, but I hadn't done that since high school. But I guess if I had to, I would. Surely I could get something else besides that, but I don't know. I mean, day and time you live in now. But I believe, if it's the will of God for a man to be there, God's going to take care of that man and his family, and he'll use the church to do that. While a man ought to, Brother J.E. Glass, he used to always say, my dad used to always tell me this. He said, a preacher shouldn't ask for anything, but he ought to be willing to take anything they're willing to give. And it'd be wrong for me to come before this church and say, hey, look, guys, offerings are up. Got some more people. I think you ought to give me a raise. I mean, I'd probably do that on my secular job, but I wouldn't do that, here, because that's not right. Now, if y'all got together and saw the offerings were up, more people, whatever, and you say, well, we ought to give the preacher a raise, hey, thank God for that. That'd be great. But, that just wouldn't be right. I just don't feel like, when y'all talked about my pay of the men, they talked about my pay in the back, I left. I wasn't going to be back there when they talked about that. I just, that's just something I think some men handle the wrong way, and I don't want my presence to ever be affected in regards to what a church will or will not do for me. I just don't think that that's the right thing to do. So y'all not do it there's been a lot of money. A lot of men that have gotten messed up over women and over wealth. That's the two main things that, men of God get messed up at. I don't think a preacher ought to be signing the checks. I don't think he ought to be depositing the money. Sister Wanda's been out, and she mentioned if you want to bring us stuff by Sister Ruth, she could, by the way. I just thought about that. Sorry. But, Sister Wanda's our treasurer, typically handles that. Brother BJ's been depositing the money, and I'd get somebody else to do it before I did it. I just, now, if a man's starting a fresh work, or he's starting a new work, it's just him, there's only so much you can do, But if you got somebody in the church, get anybody else in the church that you can to do it. You can't trust everybody with that. because it could turn out real bad. And there ought to be some checks and balances too. It ought not just be up to one person, because that authority could go to one person's head. Wouldn't be wrong. I don't think it'd be wrong to have somebody else review the bank statements every now and again, just make sure. Because look, accountability, that's a big thing. But anyway, there's been a lot of people, I tell you what, a lot of good men that's been messed up in terms of wealth. And Book of Proverbs, we quoted it, I don't know, it was several weeks ago. Where no counsel is, the people fall, but in the multitude of counselors, there's safety. So there's accountability in the multitude of counselors. There's safety. If a man gets too much power, there's danger in that. I know of a church right now. They're still going. The pastor, basically, from what I was told, started, I don't know if he started the work or whatever, but evidently he's like the CEO of the place. And so there's not really anybody that's going to vote him out or take him out. I mean, it's just, I hate it, but, it's just the way it is. This church building, the grounds are not in my name at all. I don't think they ought to be in an individual's name anyway. At the very least, it ought to be like a charter group of a committee of a handful of people. And you ought not say, well, because people say, well, this church ground's mine and it's my name and I'm going to do this and do that. No, you don't need to do that. So it's God's property. God's given it to us. And so there's been a lot of good men that's gotten sideways over this issue of greedy, filthy lucre. And 1 Timothy chapter 6, turn a few pages to the right. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 9. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse number 9. Talking about being greedy of filthy lucre. I'm trying to get through this quick, but, it'd be all right. Needs to be said. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 9. But they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lust, which drown men in destruction and perdition. Here's the famous verse. Everybody knows this verse. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrow. It wasn't somebody else's fault, it was their own fault. Verse 11, but thou, O man of God, keep in mind, 1 Timothy is written from Paul to the young man Timothy, the young pastor. But thou, O man of God, flee these things and follow after righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, meekness. Fight the good fight of faith, lay hold on eternal life, whereunto thou art also called and hast professed a good profession before many witnesses. The love of money in itself is not bad, but the love of money, and most people that have a lot of money love it. I mean, let's just be honest about it. And that's probably why God don't trust a lot of us with a lot of money, because he knows we'd probably stay gone all the time, wouldn't tithe, wouldn't be faithful to church. And, it's just reality. Be honest about it. And, I got a little bit. I don't have a whole lot spare, but, just the way it goes. I mean, thank God for the money he lets us, but there's always enough money to pay the bills. Thank the Lord for that. But the love of money is the root of all evil, and you'll pierce yourself through with many sorrow. In terms of the love of money, it could be the love of possession, because you're in a place where you're in so much debt, you got to work so much, and you got to make so much money to pay off debts. And look, you don't need a brand new vehicle. You need a vehicle that'll get you point A to point B, and sometimes you got to keep them up. That's just thank God for something that you have that you can keep up. And so whether it's a Ford or Chevy, I've had both, and both's done me dirty and good in some ways. But just the way it is. That love of money, though, it can be a problem, and you better be careful about that. Just counting. A lot of people start counting their chicks before they hatch, is the old saying, and they're just so fixated on, if I do this, I'll get this, or if I do this, I'll get this. And I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with having plans, but at the same time, Paul told Timothy, he said, you just flee from all these things. You flee from them. The pressure of debt can make men and women do things they normally would not do. And we're going to get into that here in a minute. Now, the next qualification, not greedy of filthy lucre, but patient. We've talked about being sober-minded, being level-headed, and patience goes along with that. It's been said, don't pray for patience, because, and I get that, because you only learn patience from experience. Typically, people don't learn patience by not going through something. The only way you're going to learn patience is to go through something. That's why they say don't pray for it, and I get it. But we're commanded to have patience. The book of James says, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into divers temptations, knowing this, that the trying your faith worketh patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that you may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. So when our faith is tried, that works patience in our life. When there are situations where all we can do is trust God, we can pray, and we can wait, that teaches us patience, whether we want it taught or not. And I don't know how you are, but I need that taught to me. I mean, I'm not telling the Lord to put me through stuff, but at the same time, that's the only way you're going to learn patience. You got to have patience as a Christian, as a believer, as a person. But I'm gonna tell you, as a pastor, that's probably one of the biggest things I struggle with is patience. Y'all don't see it a whole lot. Sometimes you do, but y'all really don't. Y'all can't see everything that goes on in my mind. That's a good thing, trust me. But I'm the world's worst about being patient. Praise God, I don't hear or see yours either. So that's the way it goes. I heard that. Look, there are times I'm working on something, and I'd be better off just. I get so mad, frustrated. I don't start throwing stuff across the yard like my dad. I love my dad, but we used to work on stuff, and I remember when he was working on a weed eater one time. He just got mad. He just chucked that thing across the backyard. I thought, man, that's really gonna fix it, I told him, I said, Dad, and it made him mad. I should have said this, but just bear with me a little of my folly. I said, Dad, you need to have the patience of Job. He said, I don't have it, which I didn't have it either. So I guess there wasn't no point in me saying that. But anyway, get a few laughs out of you. Maybe I got some of your attention that way. But there's some things, you work on. You'd be better off just leaving it alone for a couple of hours or just walking away, taking a break, watch another YouTube video about it, and then pray about it for sure. Go back the next day. And sometimes, man, it'll just fall into place like that. I remember I was working on a boat motor one time, and I just, despise that stuff. I like it, but sometimes I despise the junk I get myself into. And I could not. One little bolt on this water jacket gasket mess or whatever. If I had somebody with smaller hands, probably could have got it. I was trying to cut a corner instead of dropping the whole bottom of the motor out. But anyway, I fought for that thing, fought with it, and I got so mad. And I just left it alone, and I finally told Amber, I said, I'm just going to have to quit, because my mind's fixated on it. How in the world am I going to fix this? How am I going to do this? I'd have been better off probably doing it the way it was supposed to be done, but, I was impatient, like I said. Like I really need to get that boat out on the water quick. I was going fishing a whole lot. I hadn't even taken that thing out in a year. But anyway, I went back, I think it's just a couple days later after I just chilled out, and boom, it's done. I had that fixed like within 5 minutes, and it kind of made me mad. But at the same time, that's a lesson you learn. You learn patience. As a pastor, you got to have patience with people. You got to be long suffering. I'm not talking about sweeping sin under the rug. I'm not talking about losing testimony to church. But you do have to try your best to be level-headed. I'm very impatient, and that's why I'm not a good painter. I cannot wait for that first coat to dry for me to go back and put another one on it. I'm awful at it, and I'm just honest with you. Confess your fault. I'm a terrible painter. Don't get me to paint. I'm too impatient for it. Maybe you have the patience, and that's fine. But as a pastor, you just can't drop the hammer over everything. And I know I've talked about that a couple times, but you got to be patient. Now, next one here, not a brawler. We sort of talked about that whenever we talked about no striker. You shouldn't look to pick fights. Many preachers nowadays, now this is just fact, and you can agree or disagree. It doesn't really bother me anyway. Many preachers nowadays pick fights on social media, on Facebook, and what they do, they try to stir the hornet's nest to the point where they make people mad. And I'll be honest with you, I'd say a lot of those guys are too scared to fight. I could be wrong. The keyboard warriors, y'all know what I'm talking about? People that are cowards, can't say it to people's faces. Or they'll get behind a pulpit and blast everybody out instead of just standing them to the face like Paul did Peter, But they want to get others so mad to the point where they'd want to fight them. We're called not to be a brawler. You're not supposed to try to do anything to entice a fight. Try to be a peacemaker the best you can. As much as life in you, live peaceably with all men. And Lord, help me to do that. But, if it comes down to it, I'd be willing to fight. I'm left-handed, so I don't know if I got a left hook or not. I used to when I was a kid. I hadn't had to fight in a long time. I grew up with two brothers, though, so I had some WWE fights and boxing matches and everything. We used to get boxing gloves on, just knock the far out of each other. It's a wonder that I'm halfway as decent as I am now, and that's probably what's wrong with me. I got my head knocked around too much as a kid, but that was before I was a pastor, though, so, that didn't count, I guess. But, we're not going to have any of that at the church, but, if somebody hits me in the face, it'd be awful hard for me to just turn my other cheek. That's what Jesus said to do. I'm not telling you I would or wouldn't. I'd probably go crazy. But I do not need to try to entice a fight in terms of picking at somebody and making them mad. Now, look, if I preach the word of God, it makes you mad, oh well. That just kind of is what it is. But if I'm doing just something to deliberately and on purpose, like single you out and make you mad, if you feel that way because the word of God's going forth, that's your problem. But, if I'm purposely doing it and trying to poke the bear, then that's not good either. So, not a brawler. Next one, not covetous. Not jealous. I think this could really be talked about a whole lot, but that not covetous it's a big problem. So you're not jealous. You don't want somebody else's possessions. Always looking at what others have. This can go for possessions. It could go for money. It could go for houses. It could go for churches too. And I think this is where a lot of men, and I've fallen into this too, but don't be so consumed with the church that another man pastors to the point that you lose sight of the ministry God's put you in. That covetous, a lot of times we talk about that in terms of money, in terms of, houses, vehicles, things like that. But I tell you what, you can be so consumed to the point of another man's ministry that God's put him in, whether it's he's a pastor and he's an evangelist, or he's a missionary, he's preaching at these churches, he's doing this, doing that. Seems like people are getting saved left and right, and all that. Don't be so consumed with that to the point that you lose sight of the ministry God's put you in. And that's a struggle with social media because, that a lot of preachers do that. They put out, hey, I'm preaching here and I'm doing this. And there's people that got saved. And a lot of them will take selfies every time somebody gets saved. And it really kind of gets aggravating to me at times. And so, the best thing to do is, though, if you wouldn't have been on social media, you wouldn't have seen that. So, if you get to that point where you're comparing yourself among yourself, 2 Corinthians 10:2 says that's not wise. If you do that, you need to just cut yourself off from all that stuff that's allowing you to compare in yourself. And you got to be careful about that. That goes good for a Christian believer. That goes good for a pastor. Comparison's a killer, and comparison comes from covetousness. It can be jealousy, where you want what they have. It could be comparison in terms of pride, where you act better than them, or vice versa. You want what they have. None of those things are wise to do. And Lord help us all. So this is really the next one I wanted to really talk about. I got 15 minutes, so I should be good. Verse 4 and verse 5. I'm going to read these together. And this is a qualification of a bishop now. We're still in the text. One that ruleth well his own house, having his children in subjection with all gravity. For if a man know not how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God? So, I'm going to throw something out here to you. And I'm not going to tell you I believe one way or the other. I'm going to kind of ride the fence on this one, okay? This qualification comes with a question, or at least did for me. Does a preacher have to have kids in order to qualify to be a pastor? I don't answer that. You can think about it in your own mind. We talked about being married, and I firmly believe that's a qualification. I mean, I do, 100%. I think a man's got to be married, because if he's not, that could really cause a lot of problems. And women could really bring him down in regards to that. And but what about kids? I'm just throwing this out here. You can believe whichever way you want to. I know some men. I've talked to one man, and he said, I believe that he needs to have kids, and all his kids need to be in church, even as adults. And I think that's a little extreme myself. But what about those families that can't have children, that really desire and want children? I've told y'all this, and I don't understand it. I don't understand the will of God sometimes. I don't know why God dries up, makes women barren. I don't understand that. I don't know why there's some situations I could see, maybe the situations that have unfolded in their life, and seeing, well, that might be the reason why God did that. But at the same time, what I think it might not even be right. It could be right, it could be wrong. I don't know. But here's the thing. I don't understand why God does things like that. I don't. And, being barren in Bible days was really a bad testimony of a woman, but a lot of these women, they prayed, and God saw their need and heard their supplication and let them have a child. I don't understand all that stuff, but I'm just throwing this out here to you. What about those kids? What about those families? I mean, they want children so badly, and they can't have children. Maybe some have adopted children, and they're not, biological. Some people see whatever with that. I don't see anything wrong with that. Those kids need a good home. I mean, that's good. There's a lot of kids out there. They just need a good good warm bed to lay down in, and a family that'll love them, and that would change their future in a lot of ways. And I'm not saying those people that don't want kids, because I'm gonna tell you this, and y'all have heard me talk about a woman, and a woman's desire is to have children. They can say whatever they want to. God made them, their anatomy for that. God made them for that, and that's their desires, to have children, take care of the children. Not to say you don't want to pull your hair out sometimes, and they're a blessing, but they can drive you up the wall sometime too. You know what I'm saying? I told Amber, I think it's yesterday, them kids, we stayed in the house all day yesterday, and that's the first day I've had not doing nothing in a while, and it was great. But they's just running back and forth, going crazy. I said, man, I love these boys, but they just drive me wild sometimes. And y'all have had kids, know what I'm talking about. But you can't live without them. You can't imagine life without them. But sometimes they do drive you a little crazy. But that's the way you were as a kid too. So don't think you're all that. But And sort of getting back on the subject here, but it says having his children in subjection with all gravity. I'll be honest with you. Does a pastor have to have a kid? Does a pastor and his wife have to have children or not? I really don't have a definite answer for that. I just don't. I know, being married in my eyes, that's a have to. And I know some will say, and they'll be critical, and they'll say, well, if you believe, he has to be married, then you got to apply that same text, the text the same way in terms of children. And I really don't disagree with that, honestly. If you wanted to come at me and say whatever, but I'll say this too about having children. Y'all know this. It's had kids. That teaches you things that you wouldn't know otherwise. That's just a fact. There's no other way you can say that. So, does he have to have children? I'll be honest with you. I don't know. You can agree or disagree with that, or have your own thinking, or whatever. That's fine. But that's a tough one right there. It's easy for people to say that have children. Oh yeah, they got to have kids. But what about those ones that can't? I know, me and Amber went through all that with Turner and all that stuff, and that could have happened on our first child. And if it would have happened, him being our first child, we've got a child in heaven, just not here on earth. We have two here on earth, one in heaven. But if that would have been our first child, everything that's happened, we wouldn't have been able to have any more kids, biologically here, just because of all the health issues and things. So you got to put yourself in other people's shoes too, and you got to think about, how it's easy for us to say things whenever we have it all. You know what I'm saying? When we can have kids and this and that and the other. But man, there's some women out there, they really want to have children so bad, spend all kinds of money on treatments and things to try to have children. They just can't. And I don't understand all that. So I don't have a definite answer. You can come up with your own on that one. I think I'm sort of on the fence about both. It'd be good if he did, but if they can't, then if they can't and they have a desire, I think that's good. But you got to be careful about stuff like that. So anyway, verse 4, it talks about one that ruleth well his own house, having his children in subjection with all gravity. The rule of his own house goes for, and there's a lot more you could talk about, but it goes for the discipline of the home, the devotion of the home, the dedication of the home, the debts of the home. So many things can be said about the man being the spiritual leader of the home. The man of the home, whether he's the pastor or the deacon, he is the spiritual head of the home. You're spiritual leader of the home. The man of the house, it doesn't matter. I'm not saying you boss everybody around because you're supposed to do it by example, but there will be times where, look, concerning things that affect the spirituality and the devotion to God in the home, that man says, look, this is what we're doing. Right. I know you got to pick your battles. I understand that. I get it. You can't just do that every time. You got to pick your fights and pick your battles. Is this the hill I'm willing to die on? If it has anything in relation to devotion to God, spirituality, letting things get in the way of, church, prayer, Bible reading, those things affect your spirituality. There's just some things that, look, you got to put your foot down and say, look, this is what we're doing. I'm not saying you got to go in there and guns blazing and be a jerk. You don't have to have the wrong tone. And I know, men, I guess, kind of struggle with that, or at least I do. But, in terms of having the right spirit in the home, that's the man's responsibility. I know there's some men that they got to walk on eggshells with their wife and go ask them every single little thing about this and that and the other. And look, I'm not saying you should leave the wife in the dark, because you should not. That you're one flesh now. You shouldn't just say, we're doing this and that's final. You ought to talk to her because she's smarter than you are, probably. That's just the way it is. Women are more level-headed than men most of the time. Most of the time, maybe not all the time. I don't know about in my case, but I'm just kidding. Amber's smarter than I am. She's talked me off a lot of ledges, I'll be honest with you, and just told me to suck it up sometimes too and get over it, so that's good. But it's not the woman's responsibility to tell the family what they're doing. It's the man's. In terms of a qualification of the bishop, the question verse 5 asks is very important. For if a man know not how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God? Most men's homes at least consist of two if he's married, him and his wife. If you have kids, however many, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. So anyway, the number of a home could go from 2 to 6 or even more than that. But normally, most homes now are about 4 to 5, I guess you could say, on average. Really, that average is probably lower because people are not having kids like they once did. But I think you ought to try to have at least 2 so your child has a buddy to play with. That's what I told Amber. I said, we at least need to try to have 2 so they have a friend to play with. They don't act like friends most of the time, but at least they have somebody to run around, bounce off the walls with. So that's good. But how in the world are you going to be able to manage a church that's 20, 20 people, maybe 100 people, if you can't even manage 5? How are you going to do that? You can't. Look, I'll tell you what, there's sometimes in my house I feel like I don't have a grip on what's going on. There's just sometimes that things I've got in my mind, things that I want done and things that and all that, and it's just like I just don't have the right grip. There's sometimes though at the church I sort of feel the same way, honestly. But how in the world? Why would God trust a man to care for more when he can't even care for the few that he has? Titus in chapter 1, verse 6, it gives some similar qualifications to the elder. And it says, Titus 1:6, if any be blameless, a husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of right or unruly. So the devotion in the home, we talked about at length a lot. But I'm going to tell you this right now. The devotion of the home, the discipline of the home, the debts of the home, everything in terms of the home, that falls on the man's shoulders. I don't know what else to tell you. How does a man's wife act? I know people say, I tell my wife to do this and do that. She listens to me. Well, I'd probably say you're lying or she's got something wrong with her, one of the two. Because there ain't a lot of women out there that'll just, I know Sarah called Abraham Lord, but my wife had never done that, I'll tell you that. How's his wife act? Honestly, I'm just being serious. You got to think about this, and this goes for. It talks about the wives later, and I'm really going to hit that, later on. But in terms of a pastor, in terms of a deacon, the wife is vital, important. If he's got a loudmouth wife, you better not get that man. For pastor, for deacon, either one. I'm just being honest. What about his children? Look, I know children grow up, and I know they'll throw that verse up in your face. Train up a child in the way to go. When they're old, they won't depart from it. They'll throw it up in your face when things have gone wrong, but whenever things are good, they won't say nothing about that. People act like that their kids are all that and all that. Look, children grow up to be adults at some point, and they grow up and make their own decision. But as a child, when a child is under your roof, can they be riotous and unruly without repercussion? I really think that's more of what that's talking about. It'd be good if your children grew up and they were serving God together. That'd be a great testimony. But at the same time, you can do everything right. Child's got to make their own choice. And so, that's hard to live with, but it's true. Are his children unruly because of the lack of discipline and direction in their lives? These are important things to consider, because if he can't have his own family in order, how in the world is he going to get a body of believers in order? I mean, I know, a lot of this stuff goes, but going back to leading his home as a whole, I know we talked about filthy lucre already, but what about a man's debts? This is not talked about. And me and Brother Christian Dyer were talking about this and some other stuff last Sunday night, but y'all can agree with this. I told y'all I don't think it'd be wrong to run a background check on a man. I think that'd be a good thing to do. But what about a credit report? You can run one on me. My credit score is pretty good, about 800, something like that. My debt-to-income ratio is probably not the best, but I've got my fair share of debts, like everybody does. If he has normal debts, a house, car, whatever, then okay. But if you start seeing all kinds of credit card debt, all kinds of, stuff that's unpaid, on a credit report, you can see a lot of things. If you hadn't ran your credit report in a while, you probably should, because somebody's probably got your Social Security number, and you should just keep a check on that. That's just a financial advisor, advisement, I guess. But if a man's got normal debts, that's fine. But if a man doesn't know how to manage his own finances, how in the world do you think he's going to do with the churches? And I know I'm not over the checkbook and this and that and the other, and I shouldn't be. But debt, high debt, that can stress you out and make you do some stuff you wouldn't normally do. I think it's whenever somebody goes to apply for a mortgage loan, I think they want you to have a debt-to-income ratio about 30%, give or take, just so you're financially stable enough to pay back the debt. You get what I'm saying? So they want your debt-to-income ratio. Banks are different, but about 30%, I think it is. So if a man or even his wife has debt issues, that can lead to problems. You want to talk about one of the worst issues in a marriage is money problems. I mean, when the bills aren't getting paid and you're not working, or you've been laid off or fired or whatever the case is, and you can't work for whatever reason, money problems are very stressful. And if you've never had them, good for you. But I'd say every one of us has kind of had some tough times every now and again. The men or women may have gotten in debt before they got married, and I understand things can be different, whatever, but you still got to be careful about having enormous debt, because that'll cause people to do things they typically would not do. It could cause a man to water down a message in order to get more people, in hopes to be able to get more money. You get what I'm saying? I mean, you see, he don't want to make nobody mad and step on nobody's toes because he's just afraid of losing his paycheck and people not coming in. And that's you see what I'm talking about? These things just add up. You get what I'm saying? So, two more and we'll be done with this. Verse 6 here. Not a novice, lest being lifted up with pride, he fall into the condemnation of the devil. So, not a novice, it talks about, that's new, inexperienced. Not to say you don't have pride issues when you're older, but younger males typically are known for pride issues, I guess you could put it that way. And I'm a young male. I still consider myself young, so whether I am or not, I don't know. But there are some churches, they will not elect a young man as a pastor. There's one I candidated at. Y'all can laugh about this, but I can laugh, now. Back then, I didn't think it's funny. There's a church candidate as an old lady. She's old. I don't even know how old she was. Anyway, I need to just stop trying to describe her. But anyway, I had word get back to me. She said, well, if they elect him as pastor, I will not be back. I was 22 at the time, I think, or 21. And that kind of made me mad, honestly. But I knew there were some places that were just like that. Some people, older ones don't want anything to do with a young man. That's fine, whatever. I can't say there's a certain age in a man that you shouldn't elect him because a young man can be experienced depending on his background, his heritage, his upbringing, etc. I will say this, though. A man who hadn't been saved very long and announced his call to preach 6 months ago, he's a novice, and he will be more apt to be lifted up with pride and fall into the condemnation of the devil. You got to be careful about that. Now, last one, good report, and I'll be done here. Moreover, verse 7, he must have a good report of them which are without, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. So he's got to have a good reputation. You should check around on a man before you elect him as a pastor or as a deacon. Do a background check on him. I don't think it'd be wrong to do a credit report on him. If he's got a problem with that, then he's got something to hide. Check out some references on him. When you have a job employment, don't you have 2 or 3 references you could call to kind of get a reputation of their work ethic and things of that nature? Check with people he's worked with. Check with people he's worked for. Ask around about him. See how he does his business dealings. Does he have any bad debts? He's known for not paying you back? I don't think there's nothing wrong with stuff like that. Here's why. So it doesn't matter if he's from this community or not, because your reputation follows you. But let me just say this. Let's just say a man's a pastor of a church, and I'm from this area. I've been in Chatsworth my whole life. We grew up in Ramhurst and Chatsworth. I've been here my whole life. And let's just say I got a bad report of those that were without. How in the world do you think a man is going to be able to minister to that community and get people to come in when he's got a bad reputation? I'm not saying a man's lost and he had a bad reputation, now he's saved and God changed his life. That is not what I'm talking about. Because Jesus can change somebody's life. And if that community sees the change that God made in that man's life, then yeah, probably people will say, well, he used to do this and do that. But, they may still be skeptical. But just let your fruit and let your life lead by example and thank God for it. But if a man's saved and he's got a problem of not paying his debts and racking up bills at the hardware store, not paying them back and all that kind of stuff, there's nobody that's going to want to come to church there. And so you got a problem in itself. So that goes good for everybody, but there's a high standard being a pastor. So we'll pray. I'm done. We'll get our main service started. Lord, thank you for